We wanted to know more about the power of storytelling and what we can learn from Black journalists making their mark in the communities they serve. So we're introducing you to Sylvester Brown Jr., a journalist in St. Louis who has been telling stories for over 2 decades.
When I was a kid, I used to do comic books and write my own comic book characters, but never planned to be a writer. I really was an artist, actually. But what got me into this, I was raised a Jehovah's Witness, right? They kind of separate themselves from worldly events. So at the age of 20, I knew very little about Black history. I knew that Martin Luther King died, but I didn't know what he was about. I didn't know Black history. I didn't know that much about. I knew there was slavery, but I didn't know the intricacies of slavery. I didn't know that my beautiful people survived all that. They were brought here and they've created a whole different. They had everything taken from them: their God, their family, their language. Everything was taken, but they found a way to communicate. They found a way to escape. They found a way to survive and cope. They found a way to worship God a whole different way. They remade themselves again and again and again and again. So when I enrolled in community college at the age of 22, maybe, that's when I first started reading. The Autobiography of Malcolm X was one of the first books I read, and it changed my life. It was the first time I saw a Black protagonist whose life I could associate with at the age of 22. That book and others absolutely changed my life, absolutely woke me up to who I was, where I come from, and what I mean. So I never, ever forgotten the gift of the written word. So that more than anything, that is what motivated me to start my own newspaper in 1987, Take Five magazine, because I swore that no Black kid who looked like me would be as ignorant about his history and current events as I was. So I started the publication, ran it for 15 years. It never made money, where I was always broke, but keeping it going, keeping it out there, earning, gaining more and more readers, more and more respect, more and more awards.
The respect and trust he built within the community is the reason why he was the Deaconess Foundation's first choice for a year-long fellowship with the St. Louis American to write narratives about how COVID-19 is affecting Black people.
When I first heard that I got this job, this assignment, my girlfriend contacted COVID. And so I thought, oh my God, I want to write about these experiences, but I don't want to be part of the story. I don't want to be talking about me having the illness and going to the hospital and all that stuff. Fortunately, she was asymptomatic, and I didn't get it at all. I went and got tested and didn't have it at all. But so I entered the game on a very alarming note. More importantly to me is putting an African American face, sentiments, feelings on the pandemic. It's a huge opportunity for me. It's also rather challenging because, again, my job is to tell stories. I need to go beyond the statistics. We all know the statistics that African Americans are disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. We have so many existing conditions, which is high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, which also, adds to the ailment. We know that. But, I've had this opportunity to go beyond that, to go in and talk about, people, and individual stories.
Some of Sylvester's favorite stories he has written for the fellowship focus on strength, resilience, and faith.
There was a 76-year-old church woman. Her name was Ella Owens. Her whole life was the church. She contacted the virus, and her biggest fear wasn't about her. It was about the people she had delivered food and medicine to, the other churchgoers, and people she'd been around. She survived, and so did her husband. But it was a interesting story about faith, and she saw it as God testing her. God testing her to make her an example of His power and His strength. So I thought that was a wonderful, beautiful story.
But sometimes it's hard to produce those beautiful stories because when there's so much breaking news, storytelling can get left on the back burner. That's why Sylvester has been grateful for the fellowship's emphasis on narrative journalism.
I just did a story on young people and how they're they are one of the largest percentages of people, millennials, who are now buying insurance. And they're now buying insurance because, the fragility of life. I thought that was interesting too. Talked to a young man who just had a baby, 2-year-old baby, and some other folks, and to tell why they're buying insurance. So the 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 big story is the fact that I can tell all these wonderful stories. And the challenge is most newspapers are strictly news. They don't really cherish or get into narratives writing, storytelling. So it's kind of hard to really to do that, to write those kind of stories, and to get past the editors. Again, that's my beat with the fellowship is to write narrative stories, but still, in the context of a newspaper, it can be challenging. Telling stories and writing like a columnist when you're not really a columnist in this particular role.
And telling the stories of how COVID-19 is affecting his community gets personal.
I bring that same paranoia and suspicion to the table when I talk about, clinical trials and who will get the vaccine first and why African Americans are hesitant to participate in those things. I think I bring the same fears about mortality. And, I have diabetes, I have high blood pressure. So I'm in that vulnerable category. So I ask questions to people that I'm asking myself. And of course, there's just the fear of losing a loved one. My biggest fear was not about myself, it was about my grown children, my grandchildren, my sisters and brothers. I lost a sister back in July. It wasn't COVID related, but it was traumatic. And so I can only imagine what it's like to lose a loved one. So all these life experiences, all these, the Black experience that is me, I could channel that through my questions and interviews with African Americans.
He sees it as his responsibility to say what the press won't say about the concerns Black people have about clinical trials and vaccines.
I did a story recently on the clinical trials. The idea was to encourage African Americans to be involved because we are disproportionately impacted. But you can't do that without acknowledging the history of clinical trials, which is what I did. I did a brief history from slavery up until, I don't know, the early 80s to show that we're not just, a childish, paranoid people. Things really happen in the name of science that we know about. We know about the Tuskegee experiment, but there are so many others that, those stories have been told and passed down from generation to generation. We're just not afraid or concerned out of, our imaginations. This stuff is real. And so, you have to address that. And if you really know Black people, you know if you're going to tell this story and ask them to be involved with these clinical trials, you have to first address their fears and their concerns. So that comes intuitively. I know that.
But the hesitation to get involved in clinical trials isn't the only concern for Black people right now. The racism epidemic during a pandemic is affecting young Black people greatly.
My grandchildren are dealing with the same problem that their parents, their grandparents, and great grandparents have dealt with. So we're still dealing with the unreasonable reality that Black lives do not matter. So here you are dealing with this COVID-19 pandemic that's disproportionately taking lives. Then on top of that, you're dealing with police officers who are disproportionately taking lives. So even if you don't see it firsthand, you see it in the news headlines, you see it in the newspapers, it still weighs on your soul that, man, life, the universe just isn't fair. And I'm a kid, fresh out of high school, going to college, maybe in my 20s or 30s, and I got to walk around wondering if I'm going to lose my life to this disease, or if I'm going to be headed home from work or school and get pulled over by a police officer who is influenced by a stereotype, who automatically sees you as a danger to him.
Newspapers and media organizations are still publishing oversimplified narratives about crime that perpetuate stereotypes and lack important context, history, and analysis about the origins of crime.
I looked at the Post-Dispatch a couple of weeks ago, maybe a week ago. They did this big spread on crime in North St. Louis. And it was from such a stereotypical vantage point, you know? It to me, it didn't explore the ramifications and the things that build crime, the things that major newspapers have been endorsing, tearing up communities, closing schools, moving black folks from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, breaking up stability, breaking up history. When you close a school, you you close a community.
But black crime isn't a mystery. It is the result of disinvestment and oppression. White reporters who don't understand that fail to ask the right questions.
So we keep attaching this mystery to black crime and ignoring the fact that if you take and take and take and take and beat down, somebody's going to, sooner or later, you're going to have a rebellion, a societal rebellion. You got police officers killing people. Without law, there is no order. So the analysis is always from a subtle, what's wrong with you people perspective. It's never from a perspective of shared humanity. You know, what would you do, white reporter, if you had no options when you were a kid? If they were locking up your parents, your uncles, your cousin over decades, if you had folks returning from prison because they're caught up in the prison industrial complex, what would your community look like? They don't ask those questions.
These stories about black crime that are often told through a white lens are why Sylvester says it was a challenge for him to write for a white-led organization like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch back in the early 2000s.
When you're with an institution, most times they want you to be a team player. And what I found at the Post Dispatch was I had to challenge some of the stories and the articles that they were printing. And they didn't appreciate that. They would do stories from their perspective. They would assign guilt from their perspective. And all it takes was just a little journalistic integrity to find out that there's much more to that story.
But one of the most powerful stories he wrote during his time there humanized a young man and changed the outcome of his life after a terrible accident. After the young man confided in Sylvester, another black man, to get the story right.
I think it was 2005. This young man he was driving on a rainy street, and he lost control of the car, wound up crashing into a group of churchgoers going to the Powell Symphony Hall. He killed the priest, and he seriously wounded two nuns. Police automatically said this guy stole a car, was brandishing a gun, and it was a hit and run accident. They assigned guilt to this person. Fortunately, a lawyer that I knew called me and said, Sylvester, this young man who's wanted is in my office. He wants to turn himself in, but he wants to talk to you first. So I was allowed to go talk to this young man, hear his story. He was a wannabe rapper, just got a contract. Friends tried to rob him. He jumped into his car. Tires were bald. The brakes were bad. Car went into a spin. He went through the windshield. He woke up with a bunch of people screaming at him. He ran away. When he called me, he told me, he had no idea he had hurt people. He was horribly mangled, teeth knocked out, swollen face. But he wanted to turn himself in because his mother was killed the year before in a hit and run accident. His 2-year-old son was killed by his 5-year-old nephew because they picked up a gun. So this kid was traumatized. And he said, the child who killed my son, I have not forgiven him. So I know people won't forgive me. I wrote that story the way he told it. Turns out, the car was bad. He was being chased. Police just made up a story about him having a gun and brandishing a weapon. Made it up. The beautiful thing was during his trial, the church came out to support him. They gave testimonies saying, Father such and such would not want you to suffer. Sister this and that, they would forgive you. The judge gave him like 6 months probation and assigned him to do community service work at that church. That story was one of the most profound stories I'd ever done. That's when I realized there is so much power in the printed word. I happened, just by telling that story, I showed the human side of this kid who had been depicted as a murderer. The church picked up on that, and they forgave him. His penance was to serve his time at the church. So I think of all the stories I've done, and there's several in that category, that one taught me the power of humanity. Those people forgave that young man and gave him a second chance. It's incidents like that that remind me that I have a gift. And that kid, that lawyer who called me, trusted I would tell the story. And that kid poured out his heart and told me everything, not to get away from the crime, because he was fully prepared to pay his price. He just needed to get it out. He needed to say what really happened. He needed to talk about his pain. He needed to talk about his guilt for killing somebody. And because he trusted me to do that, we were able to deliver that hugely humane story that changed all kinds of lives.
Stories that bring out raw emotions of humanity and forgiveness are so important, and they show the true value in journalists who take time to build relationships and trust within the community.
The fact that people know me and they know my history and they know my struggles and they know my family, it's well, because they're speaking to a real person. They're not speaking to a stranger who's been sent on an assignment from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Even though I am on assignment, they know me, and they know that I've been at the forefront on civil rights issues, on police issues, on economic development issues. So they know where my heart is. They know where I stand. It's very important to have somebody who is in touch with the community, who can vibe with them, who could cry with them, who could mourn with them, who gets angry with them about, nonsensical crime. I get fed up and I'm angry and I curse stupidity, but I don't let those crimes define Black people. You may give me 100 stories on Black young men committing crimes, but there are 2,000 stories of Black young people doing the right thing, trying to do the right thing, who need to be encouraged and inspired and, to keep doing the right thing. So I will never let your prejudice, your stereotypes, your bias dictate how I approach my community. It's like a family to me.
Culture, tradition, and family is such a powerful part of Black life, and the St. Louis American is just one example of a Black-led publication that has centered Black culture and experience for almost a century.
So they are the oldest Black publication, major Black publication in the region, in the state. They have a history of telling stories. If you go back into their archives, you'll see work by Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, George Carey, Jabari Asim, other Black writers. So they have a history of communicating with the Black community. And that's important. I find that very inspiring, that ordinary, regular people turn to the St. Louis American for everything, not just news, but obituaries and church happenings and what's going on in the entertainment world. That is a valuable position for the publisher and the staff at the St. Louis American, to know that there's a cadre of people out there, a population that depends on you, that when they hear something in the Post-Dispatch or on PB News, they're going to turn to you to get the other version. Oftentimes there is another version. So that's an honorable position that we should never take for granted. People depend on them to tell them the truth about politics, because there's always an agenda. The powers that be are in the political powers that be are intertwined with the economic powers that be. Their interests are always first and foremost. So if you really want to get through that maze, you need to have a trusted source. And the St. Louis American happens to be that trusted source. So we should never, ever, ever take that for granted.
And Sylvester says it is the true role and duty of the Black press to empower Black voices and show the younger generation that they matter.
It is our job and our role to bust those stereotypes. It is our job and our role to add humanity to perspectives and biased perspectives. It is our job to go in there and show that the kid on the street could be the CEO of a major corporation if we invested in him or her, if we invested in their schools, if we invested in their neighborhoods, if we put the same amount of millions and millions of millions that we give to rich developers into just a fraction into hard hit neighborhoods, you could change the trajectory. If you invested in young people in hard hit neighborhoods.
He hopes to leave a legacy of storytelling that connects to previous efforts to preserve daily life during an extraordinary time.
The blessings far outweigh the challenge. I like to look at this assignment as something that we can look back on. Like, remember the WPA project, and I think it was the 30s. They told all the stories they told stories of former slaves and people migrating from the south to the north. You look back on that and you get these real stories, these real testimonials, these real feelings. So I like to think that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, somebody will look back at my work and see, well, this is how St. Louis grappled with the coronavirus. This is what they dealt with. This is how they experienced it. And this is how they grieved.
And he believes every Black artist, communicator, journalist, or storyteller has the same power to push the needle forward and produce impactful stories like he has in his career.
So any writer, any Black writer who's in this game, you've got that same potential. You've got that same power. You can give a young kid who committed a horrible crime an opportunity to explain himself. You might give him or her a second chance. You can give a young lady who may have gotten pregnant at the age of 16 the chance to tell a story where people will come in and surround her and support her and make sure that whatever dream she has comes true. We have that power with the word. And in a racist society, and let's not make a mistake about that, we're still living in a racist society. It is so important to use every weapon we can for survival. And printing, talking, writing, taping, telling stories is one of those weapons. Dispense with the label. Everybody can be a writer. Young, old, whatever. Black, white, whatever. Everybody can tell stories. And when I do speak to kids, I tell them, write what's going on in your life right now. You may never publish it. You may never have it, printed anywhere. But just imagine if you're 18 right now and you're writing about authentic feelings, authentic anger, authentic pain. 10, 15 years from now, you'll be able to go back and have an honest portrayal, an honest dialogue that you, with yourself, that you put down, that you wrote down. And let's say that you do write books later on, that you do want to tell fiction stories or nonfiction stories or both. You have these chapters of real life emotions and feelings. Lastly, if you have kids and your kids become teenagers, you have something to share with them. Listen, I know what you feel because I wrote this when I was 16 years old. So I know the anger you have. I know the rebellious feelings you have. Here's my story. Keep it. I encourage everybody to tell stories, to share stories, to write down what you feel and how. Not only is it soothing and some cathartic, it's a real testament to real time, to real life. I tell kids all the time, your opportunity will come. The challenge is, will you be prepared when it comes to you?
What's motivating Sylvester to continue in this work is his dream of becoming a well-renowned novelist like his hero Walter Mosley and continuing to inspire people through the printed word.
I've been writing about Black people, our experiences, our lives, trying to combat stereotypes, trying to put a face on poverty and crime and welfare and all that stuff for 30 years. So I'm well prepared to tell stories about my people. And I think being a journalist for so long in St. Louis, people know me. So I've been blessed to get people who get comfortable with me, and they'll talk about how they really feel, and they'll tell me some intimate details about their fears and about who they lost and what life is like losing these people. So I like to consider myself first and foremost a storyteller. So to be able to tell stories about my people is a blessing and a huge honor. There has been struggle. My heart has been broken. I have been not poor, but po. But this romanticism with telling stories, with being inspired by the printed word, with being able to connect with people and tell their stories, it's been worth whatever sacrifice or whatever I've gone through, and I'm still here, and I have friends and I have followers. I get paid to write. That may not last, but at this moment in this bubble, that's where I am. And again, I control it. I can decide I'm going to write a book. I might sell 5 copies, but this is my second book, self-published, and I decided I'm gonna write another book, and I'm gonna write a novel, and I've got more stories. So I realize that I am hugely blessed, and most of my blessings come from the written word. I want to be a master storyteller. I know that no matter how long I've been doing this, I could always be better. And there's nuances and ways to tell stories where I don't say, she told me this, or I saw this. I can tell that story and leave myself out, but still tell that story. She walked into a room, she noticed the smell of roses in the air, and she sat in front of her stove to make the family meal. We're still learning how to be better storytellers. So to answer your question, what keeps me going is the fact that I've been blessed with this simple endeavor of trying to tell stories.
This show is produced by me, Lauren Brown, and lead producer Lian Yang. We would like to thank our listeners for staying with us during this unprecedented time as we pivoted to bring you more nuanced and current stories about the COVID-19 pandemic and the uprising for Black lives. We also want to thank Trifecta and Classic Beats for providing the music for most of this year's episodes and previous We Live Here episodes as well. If you or someone you know would like to request an episode transcript, please email jyang@stlpublicradio.org with the subject line Transcript Request along with the episode title. We will be back in 2021 with an all-new season. Thanks from St. Louis Public Radio and PRX. This is We Live Here.